Welcome to this week's episode of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. Grab a seat at the table as Masters rowing coaches Marlene Royal and Rebecca Caro share their biggest secrets on how to unleash your hidden potential and plot a new course for real results on the water and off. Now, on to the show.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Faster Masters Rowing Radio. I'm Rebecca Caro, and I'm joined by Marlene Royal.
Hello, Rebecca, and hello to our Faster Masters Rowing audience.
We are continuing our head racing series now with a focus on power and technique and what to say to manage fade in the race, because it doesn't matter who you are. It's going to happen, isn't it? Everybody needs this sort of a focus.
Absolutely. I mean, you're going to fatigue during the race, no matter what. I mean, it's definitely something that you have to train for and practice in your trials, how to manage what happens when some of that fatigue sets in and what your focus will be in the race.
So one of the things we were talking about this in our coach mastermind this week was taking novice crews and also working with crews that haven't practiced together. Of course, it happens, something comes about, and for some reason, or you're a deliberate throw together crew, you just agree to meet and, the day before you go and practice together. And there were some really super insights into what to do to bring a crew together and to give them a common focus. So the first thing I think that's really important for any calls is to ensure that you have exactly the same understanding of whatever is being said.
Yes, that you have to understand the language, first of all, that this means this, and practice it and agree to it on land before you get into the boat.
Yeah. One of the things that was said at the time, which I thought was particularly apposite, was, if you're in a crew that you haven't practiced with and you find they do something that's just quite different from what you normally do, Brian said, temporarily muting the habits you have for this one race. And I thought that was, set ego aside, is how he described it.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're working with novices particularly, it's really important that they all do the thing in the same way. The more you row, the more experienced you are, the more you don't need to explain how to square early. You don't need to explain getting your blade down to the water. You don't need to explain more power. But actually, sometimes it's worth just getting everyone aligned about how they like to make. Well, let's power. It's our first thing, isn't it? Focus on power. So what's your favorite way of doing this?
I think my favorite way of doing it, if I were calling the commands in a boat, would be to either have them focus on really steady pressure on the blade, or to focus on good acceleration of the leg drive on the drive, in terms of building momentum and swing.
That's particularly, I think that word swing is really, really powerful, and it's often quite a good call as well. You can just say swing, next one now. And I like to do a slightly delayed backswing, so just stay slightly longer on the leg sometimes, and then you can make your swing a little bit more dynamic, because I think that sometimes, or it can have the effect of keeping the blade under the water just a fraction longer.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, is keeping the effective pressure on the blade a little bit longer. So, having that extra 2 centimeters in the water can make a huge difference in how far the boat's going to run per stroke. So, but I think you also have to discuss it with the crew and see, is there a word that clicks for them, and something that they derive in practice or with the coxswain. If they have their mantra word that works, as long as everybody's on the same page, it's good. But keeping it simple is the key, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. one of the things, if you're working with a crew that's reasonably new to rowing, novices, or in the first couple of years, as I say, I like this call where you stay longer on the legs and then do a dynamic backswing, and I call that long legs. And the words that you choose need, at least initially, to explain how to do the thing. They don't. Long legs in and of itself doesn't necessarily say be more powerful.
Yeah, exactly. It could mean whatever, so look nice, right? So
yeah. So, but particularly you're working with a crew that's not used to rowing together and doesn't have this common understanding, explaining how to do things is a useful, start point. So yeah, getting the legs going, and then in my instance, you're getting the backs. And then long legs is quite a short call, which is cool because sometimes you want to make a change quickly, and having to, give a long sentence isn't really helpful because several strokes will have gone by, particularly if you want it, like when you're overtaking someone.
Yeah, it has to come up. It has to come up quickly. Absolutely.
Lenore says, I learned in Australia that power was called from stroke or bow side and towards where you want to go. Coming from the US, I'm used to power being called from the port or the starboard side. Are harder, easier, or shorter? That, of course, is cornering, isn't it? You need to, particularly if you've got bends and you need pressure for your steering, that's going to be really important. So what she's describing there, which is a very useful thing in sort of terminology, is that if you say power bow side to an Australian, it means that people sitting on the bow side, which is starboard, are going to work harder. But her explanation there is if you're in the US and you say power starboard, what it means is that the port people work harder because you want to turn the boat to starboard. So that's a really good situation where clarifying that understanding is going to be important.
Yeah, and what if you have a mixed boat? You could have a mixed boat of people from different countries in some situations at some international regattas. So yes, you do that. And if it's a coxed crew or whoever the steersman is, you want to make sure that those points are clear because it could obviously affect your race results.
Very, very much. And getting it wrong is not what you want. But we were laughing last night when we were talking that you can coach in a foreign language with just 8 words, which is faster, slower, harder, softer, higher, lower, and I've forgotten the last 2.
I think up, down, up, down.
Up, down. That's right. Yeah. So that's all you need. Go coach somewhere else.
Right.
Now, thinking a little bit more about power, you cannot go full bore all the time. And so I think of power as being something that, you're aiming for 100% of your sustained effort that will get you from the start to the finish. So pace judgment is something that you need to learn. But obviously, if your caller or your coxswain's calling for a push, you're going to increase the amount of power that you offer. 10 strokes, 20 strokes, whatever your, determined length is. But there comes a time when that count of 10 or 20 is going to end, and that's a real vulnerability. What do you do when you get to the end of a power push?
I think when you get to the end of the power push, you have to put the focus back on the rhythm so that it doesn't, so the rhythm doesn't drop off or and change. So I think I think you want to avoid extreme changes because you don't want the power to go up and then come down and go up and come down. But getting them to maintain what they can and keep it going and have the intention that, yes, we're calling power strokes, but the idea is to maintain the best power that you can. It's a mental focus and doesn't necessarily mean that as soon as that power 5 or power 10 is over that you ease off, that which happens psychologically sometimes.
It does. You get to 10, or even if your caller isn't calling the 10, coxswains will sometimes call, inexperienced coxswains will go, 6, 7, 8, 9. I like to call a focus at the end on efficiency. And so if you think of backing off 1% on your power and then rowing with absolutely no extraneous movements. So you're literally focused on your bit up and down the slide, no wasted effort, super relaxed on the recovery, really good placement, really good drive, and seeing whether or not you can you feel like you can really spin the boat along because the boat's going a little bit faster because you added the power, but you are managing to do it by expending slightly less effort so that if my finger going horizontally is the additional power, it doesn't start to tip and go down and make the boat go slower, quite quickly.
Yes, and the following it up with a technique call like that focuses on efficiency, and then you might go to a technique call which continues that. But obviously, the goal is to maintain as steady a pace as possible. You could also switch the focus to what that stroke rate was, and keeping that stroke rate really steady, and not making sure that your stroke isn't varying. When the power move comes off, we also don't want the stroke necessarily changing the stroke rate. So that's another way to just maintain the consistency of the rating.
So now thinking about focusing on technique. So technique is about exactly the same thing, all doing the same thing at the same time. It helps if you have a couple of things that you have practiced together. So going back to my example of the crew that has not practiced together as a throw together, or is a less experienced crew, just one technique. So if you're a novice crew and the boat's a little wobbly, I'll often get people to draw up at the finish. And if you're sculling, I say high elbows at the finish, so that the blades stay buried just that little bit longer, which was exactly what Marlene, you were saying earlier about that extra centimeter, 2 centimeters under the water, but also having a technical focus that sets the boat up well then means you can alternate technique and power. Technique probably first, set it up, power, push it forwards, and then, as you've just said, back to the technique.
And I mean, it's obviously up to the coach, or if the crew doesn't have a coach, to experiment with it in practice and find out what element is it that keeps their head in the boat and keeps them rowing well. And I know when I was racing the single a lot, the one point would just have to tell myself, releases, keep your clean releases. And if I kept my clean releases, everything else seemed to fall in place. But if the releases started to get a little bit sloppy, or you were getting caught a little bit, that also tended, I think, to affect the speed of the boat going into the recovery. But it also was just kind of a disruption going into the recovery, which then you would have to sort of regroup before you got the blade in the water again. So that was that was what used to work for me, to say, okay, if I focus on the clean releases, everything else seems to stay together, no matter what the rating is. So, and I think that's something that scullers or different crews, you have to figure out what is that element. For novice crews, they might require one type of a call. Experienced crews, they may have a different call, but I think each crew will have that magic word to keep that technique focused, because it's got to be simple and clear, especially as you get deeper and deeper into the race.
So we've got a question here. How do you do this in a single? It's so much easier to depend on the coxswain.
You have to practice. I think that's a really important element of being a single sculler, is developing your race plan, and what are you going to focus on, and is there one key thing? You may want 2 key things. It depends on you. It depends on your race. But you just don't want it to be too complicated, because as you get more tired and fatigue sets in, you're not going to be able to think of anything complicated. So, try to write out your race plan as best you can, or at least have a general outline of, I'm going to, maybe for the first 2 minutes, I'm going to focus on this, and then I'm going to focus on that. And you can also design it according to the course. If the course has a number of bridges, you can use the bridges for a focus on your power, or a focus on the technique in between the bridges, or if there's certain landmarks that or turn, or there's current. So if you know your race course, you can also maybe decide where you're going to put those reminders in, because they are just reminders. The purpose is to help you row the best that you can for the duration of the race.
So I have seen, and this is for real, people write their 2 technical points and on a piece of tape and put it on their wing rigger, or put it somewhere where they can actually see it. So if you genuinely forget what you need to do, that's definitely a worthwhile thing. But I think where we should be headed in the context of how to coach and cox yourself when you're in a coxless boat or a single scull, really and truly, you need to observe how you are rowing, how the boat is running relative to the currents, the wind conditions, what's happening around you. And then, this is a concept I learned from Harry Marn, you pull a trick out of your bag to respond to what is happening. As Marlene explained what her particular tendency was, I have a slightly different tendency, but it doesn't mean I always do it. And so after you've got off the start, and before you start your sprint finish is the middle of the race, and that middle can be longer or shorter, but the fact of the matter is that if you can keep your presence of mind, and maybe your thing is, how is the boat running? And you observe and you watch, and you then decide what trick you're going to do, and you do it, and you observe again, and you see whether it's made a positive change to how the boat's running, the speed of the boat, if that's what matters, or rating, whatever matters to you. And that is how the most experienced rowers race. They're flexible, adaptable, and they are always, even at the back of their mind, they might be, front of mind might be thinking, I'm starting to steer, or I'm doing a push. But back of mind, they're always thinking, how is the boat running? Can I make it move better for me? And again, exactly as you said, Marlene, we've just got to practice this.
Yes, and sometimes people forget, I mean, the reason we do trials is to practice, and perhaps to make mistakes in the trials, or say, I tried this and it didn't really work very well. And you shouldn't get discouraged if you had a poor trial. It just gives you information that this is something I need to perhaps pay closer attention to. This is something I need to adjust so that I get it right on race day, because it's race day that matters. The trials are practices, and it's exactly the perfect time to experiment with, or if you're doing pieces, suppose you're doing 8-minute pieces and you're training for your head race. So you could say, okay, this 8 minutes, we're practicing this section of the race. This 8 minutes, we're practicing this part of the race, and see how your focus, your power call, and see how your technique call work, and do the other things, do other words work better, and and play with it, because that's what, in your practice, if you can start to develop your racing skills inside your practices, that's what you want. So,
quick interlude. We are happy to show you the very first pair of waterproof socks. I'm going to stick my hand up inside them so you can see what they look like. So they are a black toe and heel. They have a pattern of rippling water with silhouetted white single sculls in 2 different sizes, all the way up to the very top. So here they go. And that's what we're going to be making available. If you want to know how to get a pair, you've got to be on our newsletter list. So go to fastermastersrowing.com/newsletter, and it'll be Friday lunchtime Eastern time when we'll be telling you how to get a hold of a pair of those. Brilliant stuff. Now, back to calls. Calls to manage fade. Fade is going to happen. Pace judgment is what you need to learn. And exactly the same as, you know, having a coxswain or not having a coxswain, this is individual. This is me learning myself how to manage the amount of energy I have available. I think in general, most people are a little too conservative. It is extremely rare that people blow up and don't cross the finish line thinking, I couldn't have pulled another stroke, you know, I'm absolutely blown to smithereens. So fade is about having that mental image of how fast the boat's going, that little horizontal line that I described earlier. And I think the simpler you can make your calls to manage your fade, the better. Because as you get tired, your blood doesn't go around your brain. It's shooting off, feeding your muscles, your legs, your back, your arms. And I get less and less good at thinking as the race progresses, as I get tired. It's a bit like being oxygen deprived. I'm sure that the military test this all the time. How do you react in situations of oxygen deprivation? But if you know one thing that helps you keep the pressure up, you should do it. In general, you need to learn how to be hard on yourself. In the first half of the race, a lot of what we've talked so far is going to be the focus. It's going to be pushes. It's going to be technique. You're not going to probably start feeling tired until you're into the second half of the race. And generally speaking, you find that you get a bit more energy when you know you're sprinting towards the line and it's, you know, the end is nigh, as it were. So what you want to do is manage that sort of sag in boat speed and energy so that it's as little as possible. And this is just about knowing yourself, which is why if you're on our programs, frequently we will get you to do 2, 3, 4. I did 7 the other day of repeats of one particular distance or time. And doing those repeats teaches you pace judgment. That's why we set them into the program. What's your thought process, Marlene?
Well, managing the amount of fade is also going to be relevant to your fitness, relevant to zeroing in on what your effective stroke rate is for that distance, which comes from the practice. But you need to have a mental. First of all, you need to expect it to some degree, and understand that there's going to be a point in the race where you're uncomfortable, and you have to train yourself to handle that discomfort and understand what it is, and know that you can still hold it together. And that's, that is where the training becomes very important, because successful racers row very well at various ratings. And what they're ultimately training to do to get faster is to learn how to keep that technical efficiency at higher ratings, at higher intensity, without their technique deteriorating. So I think keeping a technique focus is very important, particularly on your blade work, because if you start to mess up with your blade work, that's going to affect your boat speed, and it's going to disturb your rhythm. So if you can keep the blade work clean, and you have to have some self-talk that,
Mm.
whether it's just one word like push, or again, maybe you say swing, whatever I think you have to really focus on maintaining rhythm when you're getting tired, because if things start to fall apart a little bit technically, it's going to be very difficult to manage the power level. So, I would bring the focus a little bit more into technique, and keeping the rhythm so you keep the boat moving. And, that's, I think, going to give you your best bet.
Mm. If
Because
you
I
have,
think, yeah, I think people will row as hard as, they're going to row hard. And
it's just a question of how much harder you can push yourself and what motivates you. I mean, you may have an arch rival club and
mm,
you sort of bring them to mind and go, right, this push is for, us against them or whatever, whatever really motivates you. And, if you might, people do this, but, you lose a race by 5 seconds. You go, right, my goal, I have to make 5 seconds less fade from this race to the next one, particularly if the same athletes are racing again. It's like, can I step up? What am I
mhm.
going to do? Of all the things that Marlene's run through with us today, what am I going to do? What is going to make me come off the water and be able to put my hand on my heart and say, I couldn't have pulled another stroke harder without coming off the technique pattern, making fluffs in my blade work, disregarding my steering or something. So, it's a balancing act where you're just making tiny refinements a lot of the time, but being tough on yourself is something you learn, definitely.
Yeah, and as you said, it depends on what is your goal. I mean, you might have a certain goal, and it's really important. Like, no matter what, you don't want to finish that race. Say, I didn't do the absolute best. And I always think that your race, even if it's not a perfect race, you have to come away from the race feeling like, hey, I did the best on the day. Because some days you're going to race better than other days. That's another element of training and consistency, is that over time you're going to race better and more consistently. But things happen. Your energy levels are different.
Mm.
um, Maybe you didn't eat correctly, maybe you didn't sleep well. I mean, definitely things can affect your energy level. But I think whatever you have to deal with at that particular day, you want to make sure that you come away from that race saying, hey, maybe this wasn't my best day, but I did the absolute best that I could given the conditions. Because otherwise, sort of the rest of the day becomes a drag. Whereas if you're confident that you did everything you possibly could, and that's how it came out, what more can you do? You can't ask somebody to do more than that. So,
Yeah, particularly if you do several head races and you don't taper. So you're going
mhm.
to feel like that. If you're doing a race that's like just in the middle of your training and may feel that you don't race particularly well, don't worry, it's part of the training, but it also tells you what it can feel like. And you then learn to recognize that if it appears another time.
Mhm.
Now, we just want to wrap up the end with
Our-
what not to say. Now, there are an awful lot of things that when you're tired, you're not very objective and you can get mad quite quickly. And one of the ones that I loathe from a coxswain is when they go, I can see the finish line.
Oh, great. That's really encouraging. That's
Lucky you. I can't. I'm
right.
facing the wrong way. It kind of has the sort of so what factor.
Mm. Yes, I definitely agree. I think the other thing that drives me crazy is, hey, looking good, everything's looking good. And I mean, it's the same thing in coaching, that saying, oh, everything's looking good. Well, that's that's not enough. I mean, saying something that's just general. Well, what does it mean? I think it's much better for the coxswains to say, you're nailing the releases right now, or you're doing this right now, rather than saying, oh yeah, everything's looking good. I mean, what
There's
does that
always
mean, right?
something. You can always improve something. So I think you're right. So saying you're nailing the releases or you're looking good, because you're nailing the releases helps everyone to focus on the release and
Right.
they'll keep
Yeah.
on trying. And usually a crew wants to respond to the coxswain and do as they're told and, perform for their cox, he or she's in the crew with the rest of you. And so being bland and vague and unspecific is unhelpful. It's just
Hmm.
filling airtime. And as Kim DeGutis and Heather Franklin said to us on the podcast 2 weeks ago, it's sometimes better to be silent for 5 or 10 strokes and then say something, because the crew's much more attentive because they've had 5 or 10 strokes with no one saying anything and they don't zone out.
Yeah, I would say also, um, I mean, this could be the steersman too. It depends who's making the calls, but in this case, let's say the coxswain says, "Okay, it's 10 strokes to the finish line, and it's 14 or 15 strokes to the finish line," and that can really demoralize a crew
Yeah.
because they're ready for 10, and then if all of a sudden you say, "Okay, 4 more," when they're on stroke 10, that can be very disruptive. So I don't know. Is it better they overestimate than underestimate, and then
Always, for me.
adjust, like say it's 20, and if it's 17, say, okay, 3 more. And when you're at
Well, you
15
hear
or
the
14.
beat at 17, and that's wonderful. You think, "Way, we went faster, 3 strokes faster than the Cox thought."
Yeah, you don't want your crew scrambling, in the very last moments of a race, because that's also the way they come away from the race with some level of frustration there too. But
Mm.
um
There are times when I think you can, if you're the person doing the calls, where you can lie to the crew. One of them is when the crew cannot see what you can see. So I remember steering a quad from the bow seat in the warm-up area for a head race. It was chaos. Every time I looked around, I couldn't see like a straight line for us to do our practice pushes in our warm-up. And I never told them that that was what was happening.
mhm.
And I just would check again and go, right, we're going to do a 15, at 24, whatever it was. And we'd go into it and I'd kind of sneak another little look, and the way would often just open up. And we got all of our, planned warm up pieces in without the crew realizing that my heart was going, I was like, oh my God, I hope everyone's going to get out of the way. We really need a good warm up. I don't want to have to do an emergency stop. And so those things can be going through your mind, but you don't have to, say that sort of thing to the crew. Equally, if you're coming up on another boat and you go, right, we've got half a length, to catch the next boat, they're never going to know if it really was half a length or not, because it's about your speed relative to the other boat's speed. And maybe you're a ton faster and you get there super fast, or maybe your speeds are very similar, and that half a length is going to be 10 minutes before you draw level with them. So things like that, which are hard to verify, I generally don't stress. If I say something and I think, oh, that wasn't strictly accurate, but I said it, it gave the crew a focus. We worked off the focus. Hopefully it had a good outcome.
Exactly. Yeah, you want them finishing the best way they can, but also, just look at the whole process of the race, and a really excellent coxswain will be able to identify what each person needs if they know the crew. Sometimes they don't know everybody very well, but crews that practice together a lot can really zero in on each person's focus. And I would say, in this, say what not to say is, um, not to always just address the whole crew. Get specific. Get specific. Okay, 3-seat. Give me 5 for so and so, and 4-seat. Give me 5 for this, and
Mm.
you draw their attention, because if it's always just addressed to the entire crew all the time, people can start zoning out a little bit on that too. And
Yeah.
you get their attention when you call on them personally.
Mm. I have a particular love of getting bow pair to get their catches in early, because the people then sitting in front of them can often feel that. And then you go, right, now everyone else pick up on what you feel, and, let's go together. And, that can be just 3 or 4 strokes that you get them to kind of lead the whole crew in. And that can be, I find it very motivating when I really feel a push from everyone else, and then you feel like, right, I can add to that and make 7/8 into a whole one moving forwards. Now, a quick reminder that we have our free head races book, which has 8 separate articles of all sorts of useful things that you might like to know about head racing. The link is on the screen, and you can pick that up for free. When you download it, it also subscribes you to our newsletter. And so I very much hope that if you haven't yet downloaded that you take the opportunity to go and do that. And we very much look forward to seeing some of you at the Head of the Charts next week. There may or may not be a podcast. I haven't quite decided whether I can manage to do a podcast live from the banks of the river, or whether or not we'll quietly skip a week. So you'll find out next week when we'll either will or will not be on air. Any last thoughts, Marlene?
Well, we'd wish those people who are gearing up for next week's races to get rested, get tapered, and be mentally ready as well. So
it's going to be wonderful. See you then.
We are part of the Rowing Chat Podcast Network. Please tell your rowing friends about the show. And if you've learned just one helpful thing from today's episode, please consider supporting the show for as little as $1 per month by visiting fastermastersrowing.com/podcast.